both soup and comfort to clients of Bryony House. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye? Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 2:40. We will conclude at 4:10. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2010, the Premier said of the previous government, and I quote directly from Hansard, "Nova Scotians took the NDP at their word. As in so many other instances since the election, I think they may have regretted that. They've been concerned as they've hidden behind report after report to back away from commitments that they have made." I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Nova Scotians can now say the same thing about the new government, his government, Mr. Speaker. The Premier clearly said in a CBC televised debate, and I quote, "I can guarantee that we'll be taking $46 million off our power rates and make Nova Scotia Power pay for it out of their profits." My question to the Premier, why is Nova Scotia Power not paying for Efficiency Nova Scotia out of their profits as he guaranteed?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, what's happened, Mr. Speaker, is that we removed the efficiency tax off every power bill in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, that means Nova Scotians will save $46 million, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, shareholders of Nova Scotia Power are setting aside $40 million, Mr. Speaker, out of shareholders' pockets to ensure that low-income Nova Scotians get an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to provide retrofits and ensure that they get the efficiency programs, Mr. Speaker, that low-income Nova Scotians in this province deserve. Mr. Speaker, but we didn't stop there, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we didn't stop there. We actually created an entity around efficiencies, Mr. Speaker, that will actually continue to drive down savings, which will further improve the bottom line of Nova Scotia families.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the only bottom line that's being improved here is the bottom line of Nova Scotia Power, because the Premier was going to take $46 million out of their profits. At least that's what he guaranteed the people of Nova Scotia, and now he's not. That's the only bottom line, Nova Scotia Powers, that's better off today than they would have been if he had kept his guarantee. Mr. Speaker, 2 days into the last election, the Premier said in a CBC video, "It's time that the government did its job, which is to protect ratepayers." Well, the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia Power is going to keep those profits. They're not going to pay for it out of their profits. There is still an Efficiency Nova Scotia, and the charge for it is still going to be paid for by Nova Scotia ratepayers. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why did he decide to let Nova Scotia Power off the hook and charge their costs, including the efficiency, right back on the bills of Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is about the 6th time that I've had to remind the Leader of the Conservative Party that the efficiency tax will be going off, power rates will be going down, Mr. Speaker, and that efficiency programs will not be charged power bills. But, Mr. Speaker, I'll let the Minister of Energy clear it up for him.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I guess the Leader of the Opposition is having a bit of difficulty understanding the fact that under his plan, rates were going to be going up by 1 to 2% on January 1st, 2015, plus being added to propane and fuel oil bills, so everybody would pay even more, and instead in our plan they'll be going down by 4 to 5%. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary, and I do apologize. I probably shouldn't have allowed that.
Well, thank you. Whatever you rule, Mr. Speaker, I understand. And in a way, I'm kind of glad that we got 2 answers, one from the Premier and one from the Minister of Energy to that last question, Mr. Speaker, because it is important to know what electricity is going to cost under the Liberal government. They guaranteed one thing, and now they're doing another. But I find it very interesting, Mr. Speaker, on this defence that our costs are going to go down, even though they show up somewhere else on our power bill, that the Minister of Energy's own report, his own report, when talking about low-income Nova Scotians says, and I will quote it directly, as energy prices increase, these savings will become larger. The Minister of Energy admits in his own report in writing, and I'll table it, that energy costs are assumed to continue to go up. So I'll ask the Premier, who is right, him or his Minister of Energy?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, under the leadership of the Minister of Energy, Nova Scotians are going to recognize a $46 million savings in their power bill, Mr. Speaker, come January 1st. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure any chartered accountant could tell you that that's a $46 million savings, Mr. Speaker, in the pockets of Nova Scotians. On top of that, he didn't stop just there, Mr. Speaker. He created a separate entity, Mr. Speaker, which will continue to drive down savings for Nova Scotians ratepayers. For the life of me, cannot understand why the leader of the Conservative Party is afraid to leave more money in the pockets of Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, one of the central campaign promises of the Premier and his government was to amalgamate Nova Scotia's 9 district health authorities into a health super board. The Premier has been talking about his idea for years, and apparently his government is now laying the groundwork for that plan. But, Mr. Speaker, the only problem is no one knows what the cost of that plan is going to be. So my question to the Premier is this. How much are Nova Scotians being asked to pay for the Liberal super board in the healthcare system?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to first of all congratulate the Minister of Health, who's doing a tremendous job going around this province. Doing a tremendous job going around this province, Mr. Speaker, consulting with healthcare providers, Mr. Speaker, ensuring that communities recognize they have a role to play in the delivery of the healthcare system in this province, Mr. Speaker. As he laid out very clearly, we will move from an administrative-focused healthcare function that was under the previous government, one that is patient-focused, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in this fall, we'll deliver, the Minister of Health will deliver a bill that will restructure healthcare in this province to ensure that the dollars we spend in healthcare will be directed toward the patients.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree the Minister of Health is doing a great job concealing the cost of what the Liberal plan will be. However, Mr. Speaker, we've also heard the Minister of Finance say that there will be a cost to having a super board. And just today at the Public Accounts Committee, the Deputy Minister of Health said there will be a cost associated with creating a super board. But no one seems to be willing to even ballpark what that cost might be. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's been 6 months since this Premier has time to do the math and at least some preliminary planning. So my question, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier is this. Why is the Premier hiding from Nova Scotians the cost of the new health super board?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know this might be difficult for the New Democratic Party to understand, Mr. Speaker, but we have 9 district health authorities in this province, 9 CEOs, 30-some vice presidents, Mr. Speaker, and the list goes on. We are combining those into one health authority across this province, Mr. Speaker. We are providing communities with more say in their local hospitals, Mr. Speaker. We're giving a greater voice to the community health authorities, Mr. Speaker. I don't know how the New Democratic Party thinks that could be more expensive or unfair by reducing 9 administrations into one and allowing communities to have a little more say in the delivery of their health care.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, au contraire, there are people here who do know very well what the cost of administration is in the healthcare system, because it was the former government that took healthcare administration from above the national average in Canada to below the national average, reducing it by over 2% and saving millions of dollars that went back into frontline health care, Mr. Speaker, something that we will not apologize for. But we did this without creating any chaos in the health care system or taking away the essential bargaining rights of workers in that system. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians elected a premier who vowed to be open and transparent, yet he appears unwilling or perhaps unable to provide answers to this very important question. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is, why won't the Premier simply tell Nova Scotians what the Super Board is going to cost our province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the only chaos in the healthcare system was when a strike was forced upon Nova Scotia patients because the New Democratic Party, Mr. Speaker, was answering the tune. Mr. Speaker, because the New Democratic Party valued its relationship with the NSGEU over patients.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the briefing notes on Efficiency Nova Scotia, prepared by the Premier's own Department of Energy, the organization Efficiency Nova Scotia is doing a good job. In fact, their audited results show that energy savings were 28% above the targets set by the UARB last year, a savings that already is passed on to every Nova Scotian. Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Premier, since his own department says Efficiency Nova Scotia is doing a good job of passing on savings to Nova Scotians already, why didn't he keep them and make Nova Scotia Power pay for the programs out of their profits, as he guaranteed Nova Scotians he would do in the election?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Minister of Energy to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, we committed that Efficiency Nova Scotia would remain and that it would remain an independent organization. And however, what the Leader of the Opposition fails to point out is the Utility and Review Board audit in January, which pointed to structural and governance issues with the organization, which we've also resolved in this bill and worked with them to solve. Mr. Speaker, I understand that the official opposition, who would like to continue to see that tax increase every single year, is finding it uncomfortable that now, instead of the tax going up by 1% to 2% next year, it will now be eliminated, and people on their bills will save 4% to 5% on their electrical bills.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this whole thing has been described as a shell game, and now we have a shell game between ministers on who is going to answer the question.
And the paper.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier clearly said on CBC, I guarantee that $46 million will come off our power bills and it will be charged against the profits of Nova Scotia Power. And no matter how you try and describe it, that is simply not what's going to happen. It is going to go right back on our power bills somewhere else. Now, Mr. Speaker, we are glad to see that Nova Scotia Power or Emera or someone is going to contribute some money to help low-income Nova Scotians. But surely the best thing that could be done for low-income Nova Scotians is to have an operating Efficiency Nova Scotia that saves them money and have Nova Scotia Power pay for it out of their profits as was promised. So I'll ask the Premier, why didn't he just keep his promise, which was the best thing that could happen to low-income Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Minister of Energy to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm having a lot of difficulty with the Leader of the Official Opposition, who made such a big deal about being a chartered accountant in the election, and yet can't understand the fact that when you talk about low-income families, every single low-income home in this province will be fully upgraded, free of charge, plus they will see these savings on their bill of 4% to 5%. My goodness, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, And if you compare that to the previous government, who added a tax to bills of low-income families and changed the date for social assistance in this province, hurting families, Mr. Speaker, it's us that's helping low-income families with this.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what the government is missing is that you do not need to be a chartered accountant to know that in life it pays to read the fine print when someone tells you something that can't possibly be true, and that is exactly why we see this shell game going on today. If the government truly wanted to help low-income Nova Scotians, they would not only be requiring that the power company contribute to upgrades to their homes, they would do what they guaranteed that they would do in the election, which is have all those programs and charge the bill to the shareholders of Nova Scotia Power. But they're not. They're charging the bill right back to Nova Scotians in another place on their bill, including low-income Nova Scotians. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? It is a shame, because this is an important issue. The price of power to that maxed-out Nova Scotia home is a big deal, and I'll ask the Premier, why is he going into such an elaborate shell game on such an important issue to Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it surprises me, Mr. Speaker, that the leader of the Conservative Party is so against Nova Scotians saving money, Mr. Speaker. We removed the efficiency tax off every power bill in this province, Mr. Speaker. And then, Mr. Speaker, we did even better than that, Mr. Speaker. We created an entity that will actually drive competition into Nova Scotia Power so that year after year, Nova Scotians will be able to buy a cheaper source of fuel, which in turn, Mr. Speaker, will drive savings in the bottom line of their power bill.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Finance. The Liberal platform indicated that their goal would be to reduce departmental spending by 1% across the board, excepting, of course, education and health. Now, this is something that was heavily referenced before and after the election by the Liberal Party, and it certainly seems that this was a goal that the Liberal Party wanted Nova Scotians to be aware of. And I think it's probably fair to say that it was a goal that the Liberal Party was proud of. So my question today for the Minister is, did you achieve your goal of a 1% reduction in departmental spending?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for that question. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have no hesitation in saying that we did achieve that and, in fact, achieved much more than that. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think Nova Scotians will be surprised to hear that the government feels that it achieved its goal. I don't think Nova Scotians expected their goal to manifest itself in that way. And I think the average Nova Scotian would expect this. By way of example, if expenses are $100 and you say you're going to reduce them by 1%, Nova Scotians would expect that you're going to come in at 99. Not that they'd go from 100 to some higher number and you'd bring them somewhere in between. I don't think that's the expectation of Nova Scotians. And my question today for the Minister is quite simple: do you think Nova Scotians had the right to see to interpret your goal in the same way that you did?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for the question to the honourable member. Absolutely, Nova Scotians voted for us and they've gotten the change that they were looking for. Mr. Speaker, one thing I promised in answer to the member's question, one thing that all of our party and our leader promised was that we would give a frank and honest view of the budget and the financial situation of this province, and that is what was missing in last year's budget. So to begin with, we had a $35 million extra charge to show the university payments that had been hidden in the previous year. We reversed the $17.5 million charge that came from using a manipulated date for community services checks going out. We corrected that. We showed 12 months payment in 12 years. Mr. Speaker, right off the bat, you see $35 million, $7.5 million, and at the same time there are $150 million in increased costs relating to wage settlements made in the last number of years. So those things are contractual obligations, and obviously the budget would rise. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's fair to say that the only thing Nova Scotians are seeing right off the bat is an almost $300 million deficit and $1 billion more in spending, an increase in our debt over the next 4 years. And I think that's completely unfair to Nova Scotians. And I'm disappointed to say that, but believe that Minister of Finance was finance critic for almost 8 years. She probably should have known the operations of the government and the finances of the departments. And I think it was completely disingenuous. It's a bit of a shell game to say that you're going to reduce expenses and make Nova Scotians believe that expenses will actually go down in the case that they went up. And I would just ask a very simple question to the minister today. And do you regret framing your promise the way you framed it to Nova Scotians? And would you, given the choice today, frame it slightly different and let them understand that expenses will go up? Just maybe not as much as they might have, could have, should have, however you want to frame it. I think it's unfair to Nova Scotians. I'd like to hear the minister's comments on that.
So just remind the member to refer to the minister as the minister, not you. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to tell the members of this House and all members and all Nova Scotians that we're proud of this budget, that this budget is an honest, frank representation of where we're at in this province, and we're proud of our promises that were kept in this budget. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Health. For years now, Nova Scotians, for years now, the Liberals have been telling Nova Scotians and talking about their plan for amalgamating the Nova Scotia 10 district health authorities into a health super board. They plan to have this amalgamation be implemented by April of next year, Mr. Speaker. So we're less than a year away from the implementation of this super board. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, what planning has the minister done with the Minister of Finance to pay for the creation of the health super board that we'll see here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for Sackville. I want to first of all remind him, or I guess to point out that I think it's going to be one strong, effective board that we'll have finally in this province. In terms of cost, we have a transition team that will be announced in April, and they will be doing the actual work in terms of the CEO and VP plan for the one board, and also the management zones that will be put in place, and that work is ongoing, and I can assure the member opposite that it's going to be considerably, in fact far less than they would like to see the bill add up to.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to see any bill. I would rather see money go towards frontline healthcare service than an amalgamation of the healthcare authorities, Mr. Speaker. We know jurisdictions like Alberta have put aside over $100 million, Mr. Speaker, $100 million. $42 million of that went for severance. Today, Mr. Speaker, it's not apples and oranges from the member across the way, Mr. Speaker. That's a lot of money that can help Nova Scotians in healthcare services, Mr. Speaker. Last week on CTV, interview with Steve Murphy, the Minister of Finance acknowledged there will be a cost to this. The Minister of Health have acknowledged there will be a cost to this. And today, in public accounts, the Deputy Minister of Health indicated there will be a cost. We're less than a year away from this plan. I ask again, there must be some figure that the government is anticipating what the cost would be to implement this plan. What we're asking, and I hope the minister is frank and open, is how much that cost is going to be for taxpayers to see this amalgamation of the health care boards.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I will assure the member opposite and all members of this House that when CEOs possibly may play other roles and there may be some severance, but this is a member opposite that knows in spades how much severance does cost, because they went through it as they went out the door.
Honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the first things that this new government did was fire 3 deputy ministers, and that's costing taxpayers over $500,000, Mr. Speaker. There's 46 CEOs and VPs in this province that are all under contract with the district health authorities, Mr. Speaker. What we're asking is the government to be open and transparent. They said they would be. The Premier said he would be, Mr. Speaker. Open and transparent. There has to be a plan in place. We heard today from the Deputy Minister that no plan was given to her when the government came into office, Mr. Speaker. I would hope that they talked about it for over 2 years, that they have something written down on paper, Mr. Speaker, to implement. So again, since the Minister hasn't answered it yet, I ask him again, will he be open and transparent with Nova Scotians? How much will the amalgamation of health boards cost Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the member opposite, unlike the previous version of restructuring the province, we decided to go out and listen to the existing health authorities, and we have now great information to act on. And as the transition team goes into place and we bring in legislation in the fall, all members of this House and all Nova Scotians will see how many CEOs remain and how many VPs are put in place. It's a work in progress. The 4 management zones are of different sizes, and we will have our construct reflect population, regional hospitals, and the demands that are in those areas. And we have put in stone, unlike a previous version that went on in this province.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question for you is for the Minister of Finance. In recent media reports, the Minister apologized to the graduates who depend upon the recently axed graduate retention rebate. The Premier stated the government will add programs to help students and create jobs when the government has the money. My question to the Minister is, does the Minister agree with the Premier that Nova Scotia must wait for a jobs creation plan?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member. And Mr. Speaker, all members of the House were present yesterday when I answered the questions that were asked here, and I did not apologize for taking away the credit that was the rebate that was in the tax budget. Well, certainly it did, and we all believed the media exactly. Mr. Speaker, I think anybody can look at Hansard. I'd be very happy to table what was said yesterday in Hansard, or to read it to the people here in the House. And it said that I do understand that some Nova Scotians benefited from this rebate and that they are disappointed. For that, I am sorry. But the fact is that 7 years of experience shows that it wasn't working. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's in Hansard anyway. We all have record of that. And, Mr. Speaker, I think that answers the member quite well. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would be happy to table that report also here with regard to the media report. Mr. Speaker, social media sites are flooded with stories about the young families affected by the graduate tax cut. The Minister continues to maintain her position that graduates were still leaving the province, but she continues to ignore the graduates who do choose to stay at home here in Nova Scotia. In a recent media interview, the Minister said, "This has certainly helped us on the revenue side because it was a big cost. But we have to remember how deep in debt we are." And I'll table it, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister, does the Minister think it's fair to try and balance the books on the backs of graduates who choose to stay in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I feel it's very important to again let the members of the House know, and the honourable member across the way, that when a program is proven not to work and when all of the evidence is there and when independent voices also say that the program isn't working, we have an obligation to Nova Scotians to look at that program and to make the right choice. And we made the right choice, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely. It wasn't working. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government announced a tax review just weeks before they decided to axe the graduate rebate. My question to the minister, why did the minister decide to cut the graduate tax credit before waiting for the final tax review report?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the very party that's asking this question is the one that hollers for debt management, for the elimination of a deficit. And I am really quite shocked, Mr. Speaker, that Mr. Speaker, with 7 years of evidence that this program isn't working, and independent voices like, and I'll just name a few, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the Canadian Federation of Students Nova Scotia, and others, Mr. Speaker, with all of that evidence, it would have been irresponsible not to take some steps prior to the tax review finishing their work, because a single year of this tax credit was very expensive, and it would have been irresponsible in the face of all of the evidence that you would let that stay in place for another year. And I would expect that the other members of this House would open their eyes to that fact as well.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, in January, the Minister of Labour wrote a letter to approximately 60 organizations who provide job training and skills development for persons with disabilities here in Nova Scotia, warning that their funding was about to be cut off because of a funding decision in Ottawa. But, Mr. Speaker, it looks as though this came as news to Ottawa. Last month, the Federal Minister of Labour, Jason Kenney, wrote to the Premier expressing some concern with how the Premier had been handling labour market agreement negotiations. And I'll table a copy of that letter, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, according to Mr. Kenney, he was perplexed by the media reports indicating that Nova Scotia service providers have been told that the government here in Nova Scotia had told organizations that the government in Ottawa would no longer fund programs, so they could be cancelled. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is this. While our government continues to fight with the federal government, these worthy organizations are caught in the crossfire. So I wonder, Mr. Speaker, who's going to be the bigger person here and settle this problem, reassuring these groups that their programs will continue?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, let me begin by responding to the first part of her question. We have an obligation, Mr. Speaker, to provide notice, and an employer has an obligation, Mr. Speaker, under law in this province to provide notice. If we had knowledge that funding was going to run out, not coming in from the federal government, we had to give that notice. There was nothing to it other than we were responding to the laws of the province of Nova Scotia when we sent those letters. As far as the LMA, Mr. Speaker, we continue to work with the federal government. The minister has been working on behalf of this province. We have now moved into bilateral talks because we have some concerns around the Canada Jobs Grant, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't respond to the employers in this province, Mr. Speaker, and quite frankly, it undermines the funding that we're providing to the most marginalized employees in this province, Mr. Speaker, people who need the jobs and skills training. What the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education is doing, Mr. Speaker, is fighting for that funding. But in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, this government has provided bridge funding so we can hope to work out an agreement with the federal government to continue long-term funding for these programs.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the bridge funding that's been provided as well. I know the organizations do, but let's be clear, Mr. Speaker. The federal government transfers $100 million a year to the province of Nova Scotia for 4 skills development programs. And in this case, 98% of the funding for one of these particular programs from which these funds flow remains available for the province of Nova Scotia to allocate to these groups. And I will table from Hansard the debate in the House of Commons on this very point, laying out some of those matters. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier, can he provide an explanation as to why these organizations have been told that their funding may be in jeopardy when $100 million continues to flow to the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell why they received a notice, Mr. Speaker, was because we were abiding by the laws of the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, to be irresponsible. But let me respond, if I may, Mr. Speaker. The Canada Jobs Grant that now has become has a new champion in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, has been told by every employer in this province will not work for their companies. So we've tried to relay that to the federal government, Mr. Speaker, that as it's structured today, it will not work, Mr. Speaker. But what she's not telling this House, Mr. Speaker, is part of the agreement that she's asking us to sign on is that in 2 years, the federal government will come and claw back all of the money that's associated with it. If they believe so strongly in the Canada Jobs Grant, this government will do everything in our power to deliver that money to every entrepreneur in this province. All we ask them to do is back away from the clawback.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, what I'm asking the Premier to do is to provide some reassurance to these groups that are caught in the middle of this fight between the federal government and the provincial government, to provide them with some assurance and some security that they will continue to be able to provide these very important programs. And if it requires the Premier swallowing his pride and picking up the phone and talking to Minister Keddy, if that's what it takes, then I would ask the Premier, why won't he do that?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, let me reassure the member I've done that. I've relayed the concerns that Nova Scotia businesses told us. Mr. Speaker, this may come as a surprise to the member opposite who doesn't believe in the private sector in this province, but Mr. Speaker, the private sector has clearly told us this funding will not drive job growth in Nova Scotia. And what the federal government has also told us, that if we do not implement that program, they will claw it back in 2 years, which in turn, Mr. Speaker, will undermine the very good work that is being done across this province by organizations, the very organizations that we've just put money in place to ensure that they're there. I would hope that every member of this House would join this government and relay a message to the federal government. It is time that they support the organizations of this province who are doing good work on behalf of the people of this province.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West. The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Nova Scotia's economy shed about 3,400 mostly full-time jobs, according to figures released Friday by Stats Canada. The unemployment rate went up 9.3 for March from 8.9% in February, and I'll table that document. In March, Michelin Canada announced it will reduce manufacturing at its plant in Granton by eliminating 500 jobs. Mr. Speaker, rural Nova Scotia is facing a jobs crisis. Mr. Speaker, 6 months since being elected, why has the government not released a plan to help create good-paying jobs in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we have done a number of things that will help create jobs in this province, and we are continuing to do things. For example, we are announcing more support for apprentices, and I expect to have an announcement in a couple of days. We are increasing funding for the START program. ERDT will announce the Graduate to Opportunities program. We have more support for co-op placements. We announced, the Premier and I announced the graduate scholarship, the Sandboxes program, and we'll have another program which I will be announcing the details of in very short order, which is the graduate scholarship program. Those are all things, Mr. Speaker, that will help drive our economy. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you so much for that response. However, I do agree we need support, but we need jobs more. On a year-to-year basis, Nova Scotia's labour force declined about 9,000 people since March 2013. In opposition, the Liberals complained and complained, but now, since elected, are not doing anything to rein in spending or kickstart our economy. The Ivany Commission released its report this winter with some bold and aggressive goals to turn our economy around. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister commit to putting the Ivany Commission's goals in law?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. As we've indicated on previous occasions, we support the Ivany Commission. We have a number of initiatives that I have just articulated that we'll be moving forward on, which we believe, in fact, will support the goals and aspirations articulated in the Ivany Commission report. And I would note, Mr. Speaker, that for the workers at Michelin, for workers who have been laid off, we have a suite of programs. If there is a concern in an area where jobs have been eliminated because there's been a shutdown, we have a whole division that's devoted to helping those workers find new positions. They may need some minor help. They may need, help with simply tweaking a resume. They may need more help with funding. If they go to their local Employment Nova Scotia Centre, we have people who are there who are ready to assist them at any time. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we need bold leadership from the government. It's now or never. Almost 20% of Nova Scotians are 65 or over. The economy's annual growth rate is the lowest in the country, and the GDP per capita is second lowest, 20% below the national average, and I will table that. This is the terrible cost of doing nothing in Nova Scotia's reality. So I ask the Minister once again about putting the Ivany Commission goals into law and what perhaps some of those goals you intend to put towards making sure that they can help see the Ivany Commission's recommendations go forward.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do recall when I was elected back in 2009, there was a law on the books that there had to be a balanced budget. And then another government came in and that law was gone. And Mr. Speaker, the problem with just saying something has to be put in law is that another government can come in and change it. The thing is, Mr. Speaker, the proof will be in the pudding. The proof will be in the suite of programs you're seeing rolled out now. Those are just the beginning, Mr. Speaker. Those are just the beginning, Mr. Speaker, and I guess, Mr. Speaker, all I can say to the member opposite is she's going to have to watch and see what happens. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, through you, my question is to the Premier. Yesterday, the Premier defended breaking his election promise to force Nova Scotia Power to pay for Efficiency Nova Scotia out of its own profits, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia Power will be able to bill ratepayers directly for the cost of energy conservation programs, Mr. Speaker. This is direct opposite to what the now Premier was saying during the election writ, Mr. Speaker. As a result, many, such as the consumer advocate John Merrick, are doubtful the new Liberal energy scheme will have any positive impact on power rates in the long run, Mr. Speaker. So my question through you to the Premier, yesterday he said his government did not consult with the consumer advocate during the creation of the Liberal energy scheme. Can he tell this House how many meetings his government had with Nova Scotia Power on this subject?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't meet with either. I wanted to tell you how much confidence I have, Mr. Speaker, in the Minister of Energy and the work that he's been doing. Not only, Mr. Speaker, did he deliver on our commitment to remove the efficiency tax off every power bill in the province of Nova Scotia to save $46 million, Mr. Speaker. He actually created a program that will take $40 million out of the pockets of shareholders of Nova Scotia Power and set aside to create programs that low-income Nova Scotians will be able to avail themselves of, based on income, Mr. Speaker. And furthermore, Mr. Speaker, he didn't stop there. Mr. Speaker, he actually created a competition for Nova Scotia Power through the efficiency side. And, Mr. Speaker, that every time they can provide a cheaper fuel source, it will drive down, Mr. Speaker, the cost of delivering power to Nova Scotians, which means power rates will continue to drop, Mr. Speaker, and improve the bottom lines of every Nova Scotia family.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And through you again, Mr. Speaker. This week we also learned that the Liberal government had reached an agreement with NSP over its annual contribution to the energy efficiency programs. Now, Mr. Speaker, instead of being forced to provide the $46 million annual contribution that the government had promised during the election, NSP now only has to make a $3.7 million charitable contribution. That works out to a $42.3 million profit for the energy utility. So my question to the Premier through you is, what offer did Nova Scotia Power executives make him that he could not refuse?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, he's confusing me, Mr. Speaker, with the former Premier, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they haven't bought me lunch, Mr. Speaker. I haven't been on their corporate jet, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me tell you, this Premier is standing up for Nova Scotia ratepayers.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's going to be a long 4 years in those benches, Mr. Speaker. It's going to be a long 4 years. Mr. Speaker, my question again through you is to our esteemed Premier. In the last 6 weeks, first home care workers, then nurses learned that this Premier can't get what he wants through negotiations. He does it through legislation, Mr. Speaker. But while he hasn't been willing to compromise with nurses over their requests for improved patient safety or home care workers over their desire to receive fair benefits, the Premier is more than happy to reach a $43 million compromise with NSP. So my question to the Premier, through you, Mr. Speaker, why did he not use the same pass legislation first, ask questions later approach with Nova Scotia Power that he used on workers of this province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what this government has done, Mr. Speaker, is put patients first, Mr. Speaker. We passed essential service legislation which absolutely protected the right for health care workers, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health has told health care providers across this province he will take and go and look at whether or not there are issues around safety, what are the things around timing, scheduling, Mr. Speaker. But no Nova Scotian believed that should have been put in a collective bargaining agreement, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell you what I'm hearing across this province is the fact that member and that party stood beside the NSGEU over patient safety in this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lunenburg.
Mr. Speaker, this question is for the Minister of Economic, Rural Development and Tourism. The Ivany Commission raised concerns about rural Nova Scotia and the need for us to act now when it comes to rural economic development. Can the Minister for Economic, Rural Development and Tourism tell members of this House what initiatives his department is working on to enhance economic development in rural Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Obviously a topic that's on the minds of many members here in the House, and while we are working on several initiatives, some that we can announce today is that our department will be extending the Credit Union Small Business Loan Guarantee Program by increasing term loan guarantees from 90% from the previous 75%. We're going to be helping you. Mr. Speaker, we'll be helping new graduates start their careers by defraying the costs employers incur in the first year of hiring through the new Graduate to Opportunities program. As well, we'll be expanding the Strategic Cooperative Education Incentive Program to fund a total of 425 positions for students and new graduates in the private and non-private positions we share. And as well, Mr. Speaker, a program that's near and dear to my heart and to many members of this House is that our government will be expanding the funding for the Student Career Skills Development Program for 250 new positions for a total of 750 positions in this province.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, and really glad to follow a question like that, Mr. Speaker. I kind of question whether the members on the backbench are allowed to ask ministers any questions during caucus, nor are they allowed to make a statement during statements from ministers in this House of Assembly. So why don't we ask some real questions here rather than, I would say, lob balls at ministers? And maybe I'll stand on a point of order later on that one too. My question today is to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. The South Shore has lost 1,200 full-time jobs in the last year. Since that time last year, every region of this province has lost full-time employment. The Liberals are forcing young graduates now to leave as the labour force continues to dwindle. Many of the goals of the Ivany Commission report relate directly to the Department of Labour and Advanced Education, and I know maybe from the previous answer that the Minister doesn't believe in making laws in this province because they all can be repealed, but I'm going to ask her again, does she feel that she should be making a law to enshrine the recommendations of the Ivany Commission, and has she discussed this with her Premier?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't believe that you can legislate prosperity. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington on his first supplementary.
It's funny because one of the recommendations within that Ivany Commission is to actually do just that, to give yourselves a base set of rules that this is how we're going to progress to make sure that we are become a strong Nova Scotia. It recommends putting the goals in law to ensure government accountability as well. Goals like Nova Scotia will have a labour force participation rate at least as high as the Canadian average. Nova Scotia's youth employment rate will be at or better than the national rate, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister is, will the Minister commit to using her influence in Cabinet to put the Ivany Commission goals into law?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ivany report was a seminal report. We agree with much of what was in there. But, Mr. Speaker, we've made it very clear that we don't believe you can legislate prosperity. We are taking actions. I listed a number of them earlier when it came to things like increasing the amount of support for apprentices, increased funding for the START program. The ERDT will be announcing the Graduate to Opportunity program. We've talked about the Graduate Scholarships program. Mr. Speaker, there are a number of things that we are doing, and those things will improve life in rural parts of Nova Scotia as well as in our cities. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. 5,700 jobs have been lost in my region since 2009. The status quo is obviously not the option in much of rural Nova Scotia, and neither is blaming a previous government. It's hard not to, I got to admit. But I tell you, it's time for this government to take action. Mr. Speaker, how many more jobs will be lost before the Minister will commit to enshrining the goals in law?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the member opposite appears to think that if you put something in law and it will magically appear. The fact of the matter is you have to have the programs in place to actually have things happen. Mr. Speaker, what is very clear is that under the previous government, people were leaving Nova Scotia, and it's going to take a little time to turn things around, and that's going to happen. But the number one thing, Mr. Speaker, the number one thing that we are going to do to turn things around in Southwest Nova is restore the Yarmouth Ferry and get it back in the water.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I am on the list today. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. We have heard many excuses from this Liberal government about why they felt justified cutting the $50 million from the Graduate Retention Rebate Program. One justification is that they are replacing that $50 million with a $1.6 million business and incentive scheme. However, we have heard very few details about it, Mr. Speaker. So my question is, what evidence did the minister base his business incentive scheme on?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, we heard from graduates who told us one of the biggest impediments for them staying in Nova Scotia was to actually have a job. So that's one of the first things we listened to. Mr. Speaker, one of the other groups that we listen to are employers, the people who put people to work in Nova Scotia. And they told us loud and clear that it's very difficult to hire new graduates, knowing that they don't have experience, their productivity in the first few months of work is not what's expected from someone that's an experienced employee. And as a result of that, we put together a program that's going to work with business, who should be the ones growing our economy and putting people to work, that's at the same time going to open doors for new graduates in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, you know, having a new program for $1.6 million, that type of program is good, and I congratulate the minister on it. But if they do the math, $1.6 million doesn't equate to $50 million taken away from our students. Mr. Speaker, how can the government be at all sure their business incentive scheme will be successful when they have no idea right now how it's going to work? Yesterday, the minister couldn't even tell us if both university students, graduates were going to be included, or college graduates, who would be eligible, what type of businesses would qualify, or when the program will even be up and running. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is how is it good public policy to cut $50 million program and replace it with a $1.6 million program, a scheme that essentially has been written on the back of a napkin, and they're scrambling to put it together? Can he explain?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell you we're looking forward to this program because it's one that's going to recognize the needs of employers in our province, at the same time provide opportunities for students. But I can tell you, while the member for Chester St. Margaret's might feel that the $1.6 million is not enough of an investment, I can tell you I wish I could take the added money that we had to put in the Jobs Fund and put in that program instead of paying for the deals that the previous government did, that they've saddled our government and saddled Nova Scotians with.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's on her final supplementary.
Well, I said that the $1.6 million investment is good, but do the math, and maybe the minister would like to give up his monthly car allowance, and every one of those ministers, like we did in this when we were in cabinet, in order to help Nova Scotians. So, Mr. Speaker, this government is allowing our graduates to fail.
Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is allowing our graduates to fall through the cracks by not having any kind of plan in place before cutting a multi-million-dollar support program for graduates, at the same time driving around their fancy pants vehicles, being paid by hardworking Nova Scotians. So, Mr. Speaker, why won't the minister tell the Premier to restore the $50 million in funding for students and recent grads now before it's too late?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Chester St. Margaret's asked me to answer to Nova Scotians. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I answered to Nova Scotians on October 8, and the people of Cape Breton-Richmond spoke loud and clear.
The Honourable Member for Sydney Whitney Pier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to you is to the Minister of the Environment. On March the 20th, the Cape Breton Post reported that the Dexter Construction had asked the Department of Environment for approval to operate a quarry in the Huntington area of Cape Breton. News of this was met with concern from several residents, including William O'Regan, Carlton Lund, and many others. I also understand that the local municipal councillor contacted the Department of the Environment on March the 18th to set up a meeting with the Minister to discuss these concerns. My first question through you to the Minister is, in the 3 weeks since the request, has the Minister met with the Municipal Council for District 7 of the CBRM?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. To answer the question, I have not met in the 3 weeks. As you can understand, the schedule's been quite busy, but I can assure you, to my knowledge, I've not turned down any meeting request. It's just a matter of scheduling and getting the time, and I'm certainly willing to meet as long as there's no active application. If it is a decision that's been made or prior to a decision being made or an application coming into my office, happy to meet with either proponents or concerned residents or council members.
The Honourable Member for Sydney Whitney Pier on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In addition to the concerns about the wear and tear on local roads and the potential environmental impacts to local waterways, many people are expressing concern about the short time frame they were given to ask questions about the proposed quarry in their community. Could the Minister please tell this House how many questions his department received, or whether or not Dexter Construction has offered public consultation sessions for the nearby home and landowners?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the question again. I look forward to this opportunity. I'll take this opportunity, I guess, to inform the member opposite and perhaps all members of the House, because this isn't the only region being looked at that quarries get implemented in. So just, I guess, the long and the short is the process that's followed for quarries under 4 hectares in size is that it allows proponents to submit the application. It gets the information that comes in, as well as a requirement for them to post and invite comments from the public. And it's, I believe, a 30-day period for public to provide input through that process. That's a process that's been in place for many years, certainly prior to my coming into this office. And that information is consolidated with the information provided by the proponent. All public consultation that comes in, that feeds into the information that the staff looks at and evaluates as part of the decision-making process. So again, as far as whether it's the right or wrong amount of time, it is the time that has been in place and long-standing for all quarry developments under 4 hectares in this province.
The Honourable Member for Sydney Whitney Pier on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've received a number of calls about this issue at my office. Mr. Speaker, even though the proposed site is in the constituency of Cape Breton-Richmond, I'm sure the member for that area has also received many calls. My final question to you, Mr. Speaker, could the Minister provide advice when the member from Cape Breton-Richmond met to discuss the constituents concerned about this quarry, and what was the outcome of that meeting?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
I apologize, and I mean no disrespect, Mr. Speaker. I guess I just missed the question portion of that about the meeting that took place. Can you clarify that? Just repeat that.
Can the member for Sydney Whitney Pier restate the question succinctly?
My final question through you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Minister please advise us when the member for Cape Breton-Richmond met with the Minister to discuss constituency concerns about this quarry, and what was the outcome of that meeting?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for repeating. I guess in that context, we had correspondence as opposed to an actual sit-down meeting in that context.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question for you today is for the Minister of Health. As the Minister would know, the wait list for long-term care has grown in the last number of years and continues to grow, Mr. Speaker. In December, the wait list hit an all-time high, 2,639 Nova Scotians on that wait list, and I'll table that in a few minutes, Mr. Speaker. That's 2,639 families struggling to provide care in some other way for their loved ones. I wonder, could the minister tell us today, does he have a plan to address the growing wait list, recognizing the needs for those seniors who can no longer remain in their own homes?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for Hants West. It certainly is one of those statistics that when you come into the department and you have an opportunity to change the course of that wait list, it's one that as we review the continuing care strategy, as we work on a dementia plan for the province, we know that we will in fact be able to take some of the people from that list and give them the supports that in fact will enable them to stay in their home. And in regards to that list, we will see some improvement, in fact, in a very, very short time.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for the answer. Can he also tell us today, when will that review be completed that is now underway, and what will the priorities of this government be upon its completion?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in terms of supporting people in their homes, which is really a redirection from the way in which we have been looking after our seniors, and we have built a lot of nursing home capacity in the province. We will continue with the replacement bed plan, but in order to meet the demands of 1,000 Nova Scotians becoming seniors every month, we have to have a very significant home care program. The continuing care strategy should be available early fall. The dementia strategy following shortly after that. In the meantime, we have put an additional $18 million in the budget to make sure people can stay in their home longer and chart a new course for looking after our seniors in their home.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister knows as well, all too often, elderly family members are called upon to look after loved ones who wait. When the stress gets to be too much, often they will end up with health issues themselves, and we all have some experience with that. And it leaves them in a bit of a precarious situation, Mr. Speaker. And we know that time is certainly of the essence. It's been talked about in this House probably long since before I was here, and of all the 8 years since I've been here, we've talked about this issue. And you mentioned, Minister, as well, that you are continuing the strategy to replace long-term care facilities, but are there plans that you and your government have to issue RFPs to build more long-term care facilities for those who cannot stay in their own homes, given that that number is unfortunately growing?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To the member from Hants West, we currently are first or second in the country in terms of nursing home capacity. We will strategically now look at a few places across Nova Scotia where, in fact, there are geographic gaps and gaps in relation to the demographic, and we will see a few new nursing homes, but very, very few over the course of the next while. We know that home care with proper supports, in fact, is the way that many countries have looked at solving their nursing home problem by making sure that people can not just stay in their home, but they can stay there with a very, very high degree of medical care, home support, and that's the course that we've embarked on.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you will be to the Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia's mining industry is a key creator of jobs and prosperity here in Nova Scotia. It provides thousands of jobs, mostly in rural areas, and contributes hundreds of millions of dollars to the province economy each year. Mining is the highest paying natural resource industry and one of the highest paying of all industries in the province. So my question to the Minister is this.
Does the minister agree that the mining industry is an important employer in rural Nova Scotia that deserves to be supported?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have the privilege of working with numerous people in the mining sector. I have full confidence in that sector, and as the member mentioned, it is one of those sectors that is going to be key to growing our rural economy. We have recently seen, under the leadership of our government, a new gold mine beginning in the province of Nova Scotia. We have some interest in reestablishing some coal mines, and I have full faith that this sector will be a growth sector for rural communities across this province, Mr. Speaker, and our government will be there to support them.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg on his first supplementary.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, in September, prior to the election, the Liberal Party made a commitment to the Mining Association of Nova Scotia. In an election questionnaire, the Liberal Party said, and I quote, "The Nova Scotia Liberal Party will extend the fuel tax rebate to the mining industry." And I'll have a copy of that to table, Mr. Speaker. Despite that promise, the recent Liberal budget contained no tax relief for those in the mining industry. So my question for the minister is, why didn't the Minister of Natural Resources fight for that tax relief for this good jobs that are created in the mining industry?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, the member correctly referenced an election platform commitment that this government made. I will inform the member that our government intends to fulfill that commitment.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg on his final supplementary.
Well, I intend to go on a diet too, but, you know. But until that happens, this industry is providing jobs for the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, it's more an example of this government saying, do as I say, don't do as I do. The provincial fuel tax, Mr. Speaker, is supposed to help pay for public roads and highways by charging the vehicle owners who use them. Other natural resource industries get a tax rebate for fuel used in vehicles that do not go on public roads, such as farm tractors and forestry harvesters. The cost of doing business for the mining company is higher because they are not entitled to the same rebate. The Mining Association of Nova Scotia says this costs jobs and discourages investment in rural Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Premier, Mr. Speaker, my question is, why won't this Liberal government keep their promise and put mining companies on the same footing as other natural resource industries so they can provide good jobs in rural Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish the member opposite all the best of luck with his diet, but perhaps instead of pursuing that initiative right now, he should clean his ears out, because, as I stated very specifically a moment ago, Mr. Speaker, our government made a commitment, and we plan on maintaining that commitment. Just for clarification for the member, I meet with representatives from that mining industry often, Mr. Speaker. That has been an industry that has transformed itself over recent years, and the number one concern that industry has expressed to government is more around regulatory certainty, not funding or anything else from government money-wise. And we are currently in the Department of Natural Resources undergoing a review of our Mineral Resources Act, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that critical industry, which I believe has the potential to grow our rural economy in this province, has the regulatory certainty that it needs.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you today is to the Minister of Environment. Climate change and the effects of greenhouse gas emissions have been impacting our planet for far too long now. And many scientists are actually saying that we're almost reaching a point where it's too late to change. But we've become even more aware of the consequences of rising tides, of superstorms, and the like. The need to act to stop the devastation is real and governments, industries, communities, and individuals all really need to take this seriously, and we all have a role to play. So my first question to you, through to the Minister, is why was there no mention of the environment or climate change in his government's recent budget?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. I guess an earlier colleague made a comment that the proof is in the pudding, and the reality is that my department, within the Department of Environment, the Sustainability Group, is very, very active in regards to this. The work that we do as a province and the work that I do as the Minister, reaching out to ensure that we have standards and regulations in this province that are second to none, to ensure that we take climate change seriously and take the appropriate actions as a government. And so the proof is in the pudding, whether it's in the budget speech or in the actions that my department takes. And
the Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River on our first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to hear that the department is active. However, I would very much think it would be important to put that in the budget speech and, in fact, make sure that this is something that is outlined as a priority for this government going forward. One of the impacts of climate change, Mr. Speaker, is flooding. This is an issue with which we are all too familiar in my constituency, and I was actually very proud to be part of a government that, after a century of consecutive Liberal and Conservative governments, our government finally stood up for the people of the Truro area and worked with municipalities to make sure that our flooding problems were addressed, by working hard on 8 different problem locations to mitigate and prevent future flooding. Could the Minister please reassure us today that his department will continue to monitor flooding in the Truro and Colchester County area and update and improve those projects undertaken by the previous NDP government when necessary to prevent future flooding in Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook and Salmon River?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Close. I want to highlight that the Department of Environment is actually a regulatory body. This is not a body that actually takes on infrastructure projects at all. That's not within our mandate, nor in our funding, nor has it ever been. So to that end, I can say that no, this department does not take into account nor fund infrastructure-related projects and initiatives, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River on our final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, last year we did announce $2 million in help for the Truro and Colchester County area, as well as $15 million for the whole province to help prevent and mitigate flooding issues right across the province. And I would imagine that many people in Nova Scotia are concerned every time we have a heavy rain, just like we did last night, where I noticed that the streets looked like lakes here in Halifax. So I would suggest to the Minister that, in fact, his department does have a role to play in looking after and protecting our environment for the future. There are many groups in Nova Scotia who have become more aware and therefore more concerned about climate change over the years, Mr. Speaker. And it's not just the traditional environmentalists. It also includes our farmers. We all know the importance of farming and the safety of farmlands for our provincial economy, as well as the overall well-being of our rural communities. And this includes maintaining the integrity of our dikes and keeping an eye out for rising sea levels. My question to you, Mr. Speaker, is what steps is this minister taking or will commit to take in the future to address the concerns that farmers have about the effects of climate change to their industry?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member opposite for the question through you. And I guess the first part of the preamble to the question made reference to the funding that was allocated previously in budgets relating to concerns and infrastructure around climate change and addressing some of those concerns, particularly with respect to the flooding issues that result as part of climate change. And I want to assure that member opposite that indeed there was no funding for actually performing infrastructure work, as I stated earlier, that came through this department. That funding that was announced previously that has existed does not come through my department for infrastructure-related types of initiatives. I do assure the member opposite, all members of the House, and everybody else that, in fact, this department and myself, we do take climate change and the effects of climate change, including flooding, very, very seriously. To the actual question relating to the dikes infrastructure that came from the member opposite through you, Mr. Speaker, again, I'd like to reiterate that the dikes and the infrastructure management around dikes, while recognizing and acknowledging the concern that it does have for the agriculture industry and farmers, as well as households that are protected by that infrastructure, again, is not infrastructure that is maintained or fall under the responsibility of the Department of Environment. With respect to the interests and the concerns of the farmers in Nova Scotia, I assure you that my colleague, the Minister of Agriculture, certainly takes those concerns very seriously and has the programs in place for those concerns. Yes.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. We all are aware that the province, of course, is one beautiful province that has, and I know there are a lot of people out there who really want to go back and enjoy all the benefits of the province. In my own constituency, a few individuals have called asking about access to the Ship Harbour Long Lake Wilderness area. Apparently these individuals were told a while ago that ATVs would still be allowed on the existing trails, and there are numerous lakes and camping areas in this wilderness that have been used for generations, but now they don't have access to. My question is to the Minister, would you be willing to meet with the residents to look at this situation in that area?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Always happy to, if we're able to fit in the schedule, to meet with local residents to discuss any issues pertaining to parks, protected areas, and the trails and roads that lead to those areas.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley on his first supplementary.
I don't think so. One of the roads that is now off limits was once a road that the logging company put in near Portapique Lake. Well, I call it a road. It's probably just a trail. But it does have shale on it, and it is ditched with culverts and also a steel bridge. So I guess my question is it acceptable that this be closed off to the residents to have access to the lake itself?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to provide some clarification to the House around these particular areas, the previous government, the NDP government, sought to protect up to 13% of lands in the province of Nova Scotia. Under their regime, a lot of rules around access points changed. However, I am willing to sit down with the member opposite, his constituents, to look at the specific trail in question and to answer any questions that they have.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley on his final supplementary.
No question. I just appreciate the answer. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture. Mr. Speaker, in the Iving report, obviously the fisheries and aquaculture are going to be an important part of revitalizing the economy in rural Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, where the Fisheries and Aquaculture Loan Board plays an important part in the future growth of this industry. Will the minister confirm his department's support for and continued funding for the Fisheries and Aquaculture Loan Board?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings North on his first supplementary.
The Minister for that response. Mr. Speaker, where Nova Scotia has an excellent location for responsible aquaculture because of its extensive coastline, and whereas there's a policy of the Fisheries and Aquaculture Loan Board that they will not allow a current aquaculture operator extend new loans to them to purchase a second aquaculture operation already in business, the question is, will the minister explain why that policy is in place for the Fisheries Loan Board, which limits the growth of aquaculture in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member for the question. It is a very good question. The reality is it's a policy that's put in place by previous governments, and we presently have it under review. We're hoping to be able to do something to move that forward in the near future, and we will continue to work on this until we find a solution to that problem.
The Honourable Member for Kings North on his final supplementary.
I would like to thank the Minister for that answer, and my final question is, will the Minister, when will this review be done and when will this policy be changed?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Aquaculture.
We are presently reviewing all the policies around the loan boards, both for Fisheries Loan Board and the Farm Loan Board, and we will be doing that as soon as time permits to properly do the review.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question also is to the Minister of Fisheries and Agriculture. Recently, the Minister of Fisheries and Agriculture announced that a 2-cent per pound levy would be imposed on lobster sales to be used to help promote the sale of lobsters locally, nationally, and internationally. As of March 27th, government release stated, fishermen, buyers, shippers, processors all endorse a levy to support the marketing of Canadian lobsters during the Canadian Lobster Value Recovery Summit. Subsequently to that, Mr. Speaker, the Minister said in this House that fishermen would be consulted on the levy in the coming weeks and months. My question to the Minister is, can he provide the House with a schedule of the upcoming consultations with the lobster industry over the implementation of this levy?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the Honourable Member. As we discussed in estimates the other day, we're in the process of putting that together, and through this summer and into the fall, we will be doing just that.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in this House, the Minister of Fisheries indicated that to impose the levy, the government would not require new legislation, only changes to current regulations. My question to the Minister of Fisheries and Agriculture is, given that not all industries, associations and fishers had an opportunity to vote on the proposed levy as of yet, if particular organizations such as LFAs decide not to support the levy, will they have the opportunity to adhere to it?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
As the member opposite is fully aware, there's a lack of organization in this province of fisheries organizations, and it's caused a great deal of difficulty. The other two provinces in this whole process are going to come across with a unifying approach to lobster marketing, lobster quality, have those tools in place. We do not have those in place. You were unable to get that in place when you were minister. We're going to work very diligently to try to get that accomplished. I understand how important the independence of fishermen are in this province, and I respect that, but at the same time we need a united voice so we can bring issues forward, not only on this issue, but many more issues to the federal government that need change.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as a former lobster fisher myself, I know nothing is more sacred more sacred to the industry than its independence, Mr. Speaker. While the government has announced its intention to impose a levy, they have not stated who will manage this levy and who will collect it. My question to the Minister of Fisheries and Agriculture is, will he commit to ensuring it is the lobster industry that has the control over all, I repeat, all revenues generated from the levy and not the government? If the industry decides that the levy is not working, and will they have the ability to cancel it? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
As the member is well aware, this is an interprovincial agreement that is being worked on between Nova Scotia, New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. We are going to work with those other provinces to ensure we have a united front on the levy system, how it's administered and how it will be administered. We will assure that we'll have input from the industry at all levels, not just the fishermen, but the processors and buyers, as we move forward to market this top quality product around the world. So I can assure the member that we will do everything we can for accountability, which I demand in everything we do in our departments, and that will be in place, and that's going to be the key to this thing working properly.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this question is to the Minister of Transportation. Mr. Speaker, the Kempton Road in Victoria County is in very poor condition. Its condition has stopped people from purchasing cottages and homes on the road. The Ross's Ferry Volunteer Fire Department and EHS responders have expressed serious concern over the condition of the road when responding to emergency calls. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, will the Minister tell the House why the Kempton Road is not on the government's 5-year road plan?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. He's a little bit touchy because I used to strike him out in a previous life, but that's okay. I'll answer the question anyway. Mr. Speaker, in all seriousness, I do want to say this is the Kempton Road is one that I've heard from many times, certainly from the constituents and the residents in that area, and I can say for sure that the member from Victoria the Lakes has brought it to my attention on many occasions. And thank you. We actually we had a look out in the Bulledry Centre area earlier this week. The member did, along with myself. I also talked to Gerard Jessam, who's the Eastern Director for TIR. His thought on the road was that certainly there's a volume capacity there. It does meet the volumes that are required for some surface paving. There are some good spots to the Kempton Road, some pretty solid sections of that road, and there certainly are some problem areas. So we've committed this year to put some RIM money, which is our maintenance fund, into some of the worst sections. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, we're going to do our best to get all the roads that need work up there. But I can tell you that the member for Victoria the Lakes, has done a fantastic job, and she should be congratulated for the work she's put into her riding. Thank you.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to orders. A point of order. The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you. Keep trucking each other out here. I don't know what's going on. Listen, today I'm going to stand on a point of order, and it really has respect to do with the question from the Liberal Party, from the government as they go along. When the agreement was originally struck, it was to ask important questions for constituencies of the members, more specifically in the backbench of the government side. What we're finding is, as the questions are going along, there are really nothing but manufactured bunts or pitches across lob balls across the benches. You know, there is an opportunity for the members of the Liberal Party to ask questions of their ministers in caucus.